this brought about the destruction, the massive destruction of a great many of European cities. Now I have an image of that here. It's not a great image, but I'll put it up for you. And it's a map of German cities. I'm just looking at it here again. And so I'll put it up for you so you can see, you can have a look. So what you're looking at now is a map. What you can see is that these the circles represent cities, and the bigger the circle is, the bigger the city. Basically, it's a fairly, it's an obvious map. So the biggest circle is a city of 500,000 inhabitants or over, and then the next circle down is 100,000 to 500,000, and then the smallest circle is 100,000 inhabitants. Okay, so you can see if you just sort of pull back and look at the overall picture, that the most of the cities are half to three quarters blackened out. Some of the smaller cities maybe a quarter or less. The amount that's black is the amount of people who are killed proportionate to the city. So if you look at a city like Dresden, for instance, which is over on the right-hand side of the map, you'll see that near the border, you'll see that it is basically sort of, what might that be? Sort of kind of 4.5 sixths complete. In other words, it's been. In other words, the population, that's how much of the population has been killed by saturation bombing campaigns. Now, these saturation bombing campaigns are just massive, and they are, if you see, there's the area around Essen and Aachen, which is considered to be where a great deal of the German manufacturing center is. You can see that it's the inset panel. So if you look up at the top of the map, you'll see another little rectangle inside, and this is the area that's around Essen and Oberhausen. Yeah, and this is the famous Ruhr Valley, which was the industrial heartland of Germany, in the same way that the corridor between stretching from New York along the sort of northern border of the United States with Canada toward Chicago, including Pennsylvania, including Philadelphia, that this is where a lot of the main industrial power was, and then in the Northeast, in New York State, and as I say, New Jersey. So what you're looking at is a lot of bombing, and these bombing raids are flown at night by British and Canadian air crews. The bombers are in general made by the Americans, and this is part of the deal that the Americans make with the Brits at the beginning of the war, when Roosevelt wants to support the war, but he can't convince America yet to get in. And so what he can do is he can make stuff and pass it on to Britain, which is what happens in what's called the Lend-Lease Act. So what you have is British and Canadian air crews getting in their bombers, and they fly from airfields all over Britain, because Britain is right across the English Channel it's the closest there is basically to Germany, right? They can't set up air bases in France because they don't have France yet. So they begin to bomb, so they have to fly across the English Channel, and then start bombing, dropping bombs. And they do it mostly at night because it's too dangerous to bomb during the day when they got shot down. They don't have air cover, so what happens is you have a fleet or a squadron of these bombers, and they're big relatively at the time, but now they're quite small. I mean, they have a lot of people in them, and by the time we get to the end of the war, they'll be B-29s, the so-called flying fortress, which will have something like a dozen men in it. Most of the men involved are there to protect the machine. That is, most of the people on board are gunners, trying to keep aircraft away. And for a long time in the war, they will be fighting off single pilot attacks against them from small German planes, combat planes. But then eventually the Germans run out of oil, and they can't get aircraft in the air because they've got no gas, basically. So that's over. But what happens when the bombers start to collect? They start to they begin to launch. Basically, they begin to take off and fly into formation to collection points around England, and from there they begin to stream over the Channel. Now this bombing stream is what it was called. It's this very highly technical. I mean, this is a bigger, more complex operation in the military world than has really ever been carried out before. Nothing has ever looked like this in the history of the world. It's just an astonishing amount of organization, of timing, and you have to deal with the weather, and you have to deal with people who have, the machines are breaking down, and all kinds of things are happening. And you have hundreds of planes that get into a bombing stream. And the stream then aims basically over the English Channel and begins to fly over the English Channel. And for the first number of miles over the Channel, the stream is followed by or protected by small single or double fighter pilot planes like the Spitfire, the British machine, and other the Mustang, other planes like this. And their job is to protect the very slow moving bombers, because the bombers are big and heavy and they're loaded with weapons, so they're slow, right? And then they have to turn back because these small aircraft don't have the range to cross the Channel. They're single-seater jets or aircraft. They're actually propeller-driven, so they don't have the fuel tanks to last to get there and back. So they turn around. And now the group is flying on its own. And it's flying in these massive streams. To give you an idea of the bomber stream and what it looked like, if you stood on the ground at, say, Dover, on the cliffs at Dover, and you looked up, you would see the stream passing over you, and it would make the sky black, basically. And it would take 20 minutes for the stream to begin and fully fly over you, to give you an idea of how many people are in the air. Okay. The complaint about this the discussion about this it's an ongoing discussion. There continue to be bitter differences of opinion about whether or not the policy was a good idea. The Brits and the Americans developed together, but the British specifically took over the area saturation bombing campaign of Germany and a good part of France and parts of Holland as well, and Belgium. But mostly what they wanted to do was they didn't really want to bomb the Allies if they could avoid it. They wanted to bomb Germany and flatten the country, and that's what they tried to do. That was the policy. And the campaign was run by a man who came to be known as Bomber Harris. He was an air marshal, and his job was to oversee these bombing campaigns, basically. What happened about, oh man, 30 years ago now or so, was that some Canadian documentarians began looking at the role of Canadians in these bombing campaigns. Because the question is, well, how much of this, first of all, was necessary? Second of all, did it help the war effort? And third, if it did, what did it do? Did it demonstrably shorten the war? That was, it's like, okay. So, because they were wiping out a lot of cities. But was it actually beating the enemy? Because nobody had ever tried anything like this. And in the history, really, there had never been an air war like this ever before in planetary history. So these two Canadian documentary filmmakers made a famous they made a famous documentary which was carried over a series of nights called The Valor and the Horror. And what they talked about was the fact that Canadian bomber crews, who had been considered to be heroes, had gotten in these planes and flown over objectives and dropped bombs at night when they really couldn't see very well. They couldn't see their targets very well at all, was the argument. And they'd killed a lot of civilians. In fact, they killed millions of civilians. Maybe the Canadian and British and American air crews, because American air crews also flew in these saturation bombing campaigns, maybe they did more killing than the Germans had done. That was the supposition. And so there was this was a very famous documentary. You might have a look at it. You should be able to get it. It was TVO. I think TVO supported it. And then there was from the people who had actually been bomber pilots and bomber crews and other veterans, there was a response called, what was it called? Wings of Valor. That's right. This is a very short response, basically. But it basically said, no, we never bombed civilians. And so here's a little clip from that. Have a look at this.
I was a member of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, which was attached to the Royal Air Force in Britain. And when the Canadians came over, we were transferred to be with the Royal Canadian Air Force to work in Bomber Command. And I was working in Leeming, Yorkshire, at the headquarters of Bomber Command. And from Leeming, we sent out the planes on the bombing attacks. The different squadrons would come in, and then they'd leave. We would do the routing, the course and speed calculation. We'd track to the target. We'd give them their safety aids. We'd give them their rum rations. Every night there was a target, a military target. We never went out to bomb civilians, ever. They went to their targets. They brought back the photographs. We could tell from the photographs exactly where they were on their raids. We would debrief them. We'd take the stories from the pilot, the navigator, the bomb aimer, and coordinate them with the other planes so that we did get a true story of where they had been. And of course civilians suffer. When have civilians not suffered in a war? They've suffered from the days of Sodom and Gomorrah and the siege of Paris, and civilians have always been under attack. But we never, ever sent them out without some military target. When the V1s and the V2s came to Britain, they weren't aimed at any military targets. I have seen buildings knocked down in London and shattered with the senseless V2s. I've been in bombing raids.